But right now, I want us to get into the study of Mark's Gospel. We left off around verse 10. I want us to step back to verse 9 and pick that up as we move. Let me read a few of these verses. I do want to make a point today. If you're following along in your Bibles, and I hope you are, you will notice there are some divisions in most of our English Bibles where the paragraphs will be divided and you probably have a title above them. Well, remember, all of those are very modern insertions into your scripture. Those are not part of the original text. This is people trying to help you make better sense of it, and sometimes it breaks up a flow of thought, and it'll do that today. That's why I'm making that point. So let's begin. Let's go back to verse 9 and pick up the reading there. We had just come through that whole proclamation of John the Baptizer. And John showed up, and John has just made the announcement in verse 7. The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie the thong of his sandals. So we've got this. And then we come into verse 9. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Now, after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. And I'll stop there. The proclamation there is called the inaugural address. And I'll say this, we may or may not get to that inaugural address today, but I will point out this for your thought for next week, possibly, and as you read other Gospels. The first proclamation that Jesus makes in a Gospel is called his inaugural address. Pay attention to what the Gospel says or Jesus' first address, because that's the story that this author is going to be developing. And all four of our Gospels have a different inaugural address. They all have a different story they're telling. We don't have Jesus making the same first statement to the people. All four Gospels have a different inaugural address, and they have a different take on the story. We're going to look at Mark's story, of course, but we will, especially today, we're going to go back a time or two and talk about Matthew's story, because if we're not careful, there's a place today where we're going to hear Matthew, even though Mark has nothing to say about it, and it's not fair to Mark's story to insert Matthew. Matthew's telling a different story than Mark is telling. And I hope that doesn't confuse you or bother you. If you tell my life story, you can easily take 4 different versions and talk about it, and it still be true to who I am. Does that make sense? Because I have had, and I don't know where this kind of thinking comes from, but I have had people say, well, no, they have to tell the same story because it's Jesus. Well, Jesus isn't so simple that there's only one little story. Jesus is multifaceted just as we are, and there's lots of ways to approach the truth, and it's still being truth. So we're looking at the way Mark does that. We got into this a little bit last week. Let's start with actually I'm going to back up to verses 7 and 8. Because here is this proclamation that John is making. And he says, the one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I am not worthy to stoop down and untie even the thong of his sandal. I have baptized you with water. He's talking to those, remember they came out, and of course we had that hyperbole last time where everybody left Jerusalem. The city was totally undefended, according to the story. All is well. We don't need any guards on the walls. It's all, and yet all wasn't well. And so John is out there baptizing, and he says, I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. Now we get this, and we expect in the story for someone to show up. Okay, we've had this proclamation, this announcement, and we expect someone to show up. And then we get verse 9. In those days, who shows up? Jesus. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Do you hear it? I mean, all is just ordinary. And yet, you almost feel like, yeah, all is ordinary, but we're on the verge of something. In those days, you're telling a story. You're building a little bit of anticipation here. And you can almost feel it. And then, as I pointed out last week, verse 10, my translation says, and just as he was coming up out of the water. The word and is the Greek word kai. And it can be translated into English as and or but. And so anybody that's translating from Greek to English has to make a decision. Do I use the word and here, or do I use the word but here? When I translate this verse, I use the word but. Get the feel of it as you hear it translated the way I do. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. But just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens schizoid. We talked about that word last week. Schizo is the Greek word we get our English schizophrenia comes from this word. This is a very violent word. It is a violent ripping. Okay? It's a violent ripping. And so, but just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw in the skies this violent tearing apart. I've seen this translated as the skies opened. That's a bad translation. That seems so graceful. This is a violent ripping, like something is there and it's escaping. And what do we find coming through this violent opening? And by the way, the word I think is crucially chosen by Mark, by the author of Mark's Gospel, because we're going to get the same word in Holy Week at the end of the story. And I'll go ahead and give you the heads up. I mentioned it last week. When we get to the crucifixion, we find the scene is the temple. Now, where does in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish thinking of that time, where does God live? In the temple. And where in the temple specifically? The Holy of Holies. And there is a thick curtain that is the doorway. In fact, this is such a holy place that the priests that would go in once a year to make atonement for sin, they would tie a rope around his waist, and that rope would be out where the people are in case he dies in there. They can pull him out, see? Because nobody can go in. It's that sacred and holy. They put bells on him so they can hear him moving around in there. If the bells stopped for too long, they'd tug on the rope. Is he alive? You know, did God kill him? Did he die? What happened to him? So that's how serious the Jewish religion takes this sacred space. This is where God presides. And at the end of the story, the Bible the Mark's Gospel tells us that curtain is schizoid. That word where it says the curtain was torn apart from top to bottom is the same word that we have of the sky being open. And I think Mark is making a statement. In this opening where we are, God is let loose in Jesus. God is let loose in this man. This is the incarnation for Mark's Gospel. There is no birth narratives. Did you notice that? We don't have a Virgin Mary. We don't have any birth of Jesus in Mark's Gospel. So this is the incarnation story for Mark. And this is where God is let loose in the life of Jesus. And we're going to see Jesus' ministry is going to begin now. So what's being let loose from the Holy of Holies at the end of the story? God. And now, who's God being let loose in? You! It's a great way to tell the story. So, in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. But just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens violently ripped apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. First of all, get the image of a dove out of your mind. It doesn't say a dove descended on him, did it? The Spirit descended on him. The Spirit like a dove. See, for years I had this nice little dove floating down, and oh, how cool, you know? I like doves. But what is the author saying?
It was the Spirit.
It's the Spirit.
It is the Spirit, but why symbolize this as a dove?
Pure white.
We're going to connect back to the Hebrew. They're scriptures. We have already connected to the Genesis story, right? In the beginning. Where does the dove come into play in that early Genesis stories? The flood. Remember? After all the flood, what does Noah send out to see if the land is inhabitable? A dove. A dove. So this flood story, the dove is sent out to see if the land has appeared after that flood. Now, and that's, I believe that's where that Jewish mindset's going to go. That's their stories. See, our mindsets go many times to our Gospels because that's our story. Well, this whole Genesis account is their story. That's our story too, but I mean, this is their sacred scriptures. And they relate to this. So when they see this like a dove, their mind is going back to that Noah story, where after that whole horrendous event of that flood, this life comes out to find if things are ready to be inhabited. And so, like a dove. Now, it's like a dove. So in what way is the Spirit of God like a dove?
Gently ascending.
Okay, possibly gently ascending. We might get a challenge on that, but I can see that gentleness. Now, that gentleness is going to do something.
It's saying that he released so that supposedly the people are ready to receive this.
You know, I like that. The people are now ready to receive. That dove went out to sea, and now let's see if the people are ready to receive this one. I think that anything else? Yeah.
Well, the dove of Noah went out, came back, and let them know that their salvation was there.
Yeah.
The dove came down on Jesus.
And let them know that the salvation was there. I like that. You see, the Jewish mindset would have been looking at those kinds of things. All of that, yeah. So this is not a dove, but there is like a dove. So we can pick up a reference there, like a dove. So just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens violently ripped apart, and the Spirit descending like a dove, and a voice came from heaven. Okay, we got a voice coming from heaven. We have been prepared for this voice in chapter 1, verse 1. Who do you think the voice might be? Look at chapter 1, verse 1. This might be God. This voice comes from heaven because we were told in verse 1 that Jesus is who? God's Son, the Son of God. And so now we've seen we're brought in on the story where the heavens are ripped and this, like a dove, the Spirit descends on Jesus. And then this voice came from heaven. Notice what the voice says. You are my Son. Who's the voice talking to?
Jesus.
Okay. In some of the other stories, the voice is not directed specifically to Jesus. It is wherever. In fact, people say, was that thunder? What was that? We don't have that. That's somebody else's story. This is a communication from God to God's Son. Okay, so this is a personal conversation, if you will. So the Spirit, a voice came from heaven saying, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." Wow. Oh, by the way, I want to go back to this in just a moment. When that sky is violently ripped apart and God is set loose in this man Jesus, what would we as Christians call that? Blessed. Beware, yes. But this is God's doing. This is blessings. You know, sometimes blessings may not look comforting at first. And I say that because I want you to forget that probably your Bible has a 3/4 of an inch space between verses 11 and 12 and maybe some words that are added in there. I want you to let this story flow, because when you do that, here's what you get. And a voice came from heaven. "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately drove him. Whoa, wait a minute. Can't I at least take a moment to just kind of bask in this, you know? I mean, isn't that what, see, that's what that division does. It tempts you to miss this immediately. The moment that the Spirit descends upon Jesus, and Jesus hears the communication, "You are my Son. Wow, I'm excited about you." Immediately, Jesus, now look at this verse. And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. Immediately drove him out into the wilderness. Verse 11 was a summons. This is in that story flow, was the summonsing moment. God is summoning Jesus. You're my son. You're the beloved. I am well pleased with you. Journey stories always have guides along the way. And these guides will lead the hero. And the Spirit shows up as this guide. Interesting. The guide in the story for Jesus is the Spirit. Now, you know the story. We're not cheating, but you know the story. Go on and into the book of Acts. What is the guide that Jesus leaves for us? It's the same. It's the Spirit. This journey story where the hero sets out to accomplish, and the guide is the Spirit, is the same Spirit that when we are to set out on our mission for God, becomes our guide. So an important insertion here into the call, if you will, because our call is modeled in this. So, this Spirit or guide drives Jesus out into the wilderness. This is another, in the Greek, this is another violent type of a forceful, if you will. It's ekbalo. And balo is the word to throw, and ek is out. This isn't, okay, Jesus, come on, let's go. This is a throwing Jesus out. That's the choice of words in the Greek, is a throwing, pick up and just force you out. It's a violent word. Just as schizoid is a violent word, this is a violent word to thrust Jesus out into where? The wilderness. The wilderness. And this thrusting out, this word can be translated thrown out or tossed out or kicked out or forced out. It cannot be adequately or correctly translated led out. There are a couple of translations that says the Spirit led Jesus out into the wilderness. No, this is a throwing out or a tossing out or a kicking out. It's a forced exit. Like schizoid, it's that kind of a violent image. And when does the Spirit do this? Immediately. There's no pause in the story. Immediately is probably, I erased the word, I had it up there in the Greek. Euthus is probably Mark's favorite word. In the New Testament, this Greek word that we translate immediately, right now, spur of the moment, no pausing, is used 59 times in the New Testament. 42 of those times are in Mark's little gospel. Yeah. So overwhelmingly, Mark takes this word and uses it as a part of his story. And we're going to have to pay attention to these Greek words because sometimes our English translations let us down. We're going to get into a story of the feeding of the 5,000. This is coming up, the feeding of the 5,000, where in the Greek, the author uses the same word for bread over and over and over and over and over, and it makes you almost nauseous. Our English does a much better job. It'll say bread or lunch, and bread, and it'll use all these different words, and it loses its power because after Mark uses bread, the disciples are going to say at a time real soon after that, I wonder if it was the bread. But you missed that if you called it by 3 or 4 different names. things. And so we're going to have to pay attention. You don't have to be a Greek scholar. I'll point out stuff like this, what they mean. But we're going to have to pay attention to what some of these words are, because our English language sometimes doesn't convey the same forcefulness or meaning that we get, the richness, at least, of the meaning that we can get in the Greek. So we don't get even a moment to rest. Don't get a moment to celebrate this great announcement that Jesus hears.
And what's significant? I mean, why?
He doesn't tell us.
I mean, is there?
But you might want to look at it in your life.
That's what I'm trying to think of. And the reason I asked that is because I had back in the youth, one of the youth was baptized and she was so excited. And the next day when she went to school,
Immediately, what happens?
well, she was kind of put down.
Yeah.
And it was Satan, I guess, working.
And see, if we understand the story of Jesus, we can anticipate that could be the fate of a new revelation. We may not have time to bask in it. God may be preparing us right now for what's needed right now. Does that make sense? But see, we don't know these stories, and so we fall apart.
We want to celebrate.
We fall apart. Oh my God, I thought this was going to be good. Well, it is going to be good. But that doesn't mean it's not going to come without a struggle. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I think that's part of the power of really digging into these stories. This is the story of Jesus, and this is you're going to discover this is our story. And either in a few minutes or next week, you're going to hear me say, John the Baptizer's fate is the fate of Jesus. The fate of Jesus is our fate. And we're going to see that in the actual story. So at once, no time to celebrate, no time to say, oh, God has called me, this is so exciting. No, it's boom, out in the wilderness you go. And so, he was in the wilderness, verse 13, he was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. What's the next verse? Now, after what? After John. Okay, verse 13 is our whole wilderness story. Here's where I don't want you to hear Matthew. What do you hear when you go out in the wilderness with Jesus? What happens? He's tempted for 40 days, and then the tempter comes and takes him here and takes him there, and you go through this whole thing, and then at the end the angels come and wait upon him. This is all collapsed. This is one verse. This verse 13 is the wilderness experience in Mark's gospel, the way Mark tells it. So, how long will Jesus be in the wilderness? Let's look at verse 13. How long will he be in the wilderness? 40 days. The Hebrew tradition uses the word 40 like we might use the word 100. How many marbles are in that thing? About 100. Is that precise? Now, we don't use 100 as precise. Now, we can. And that's what the Jews do with this word 40. It's an important word. We wouldn't, if 100 was an important word, we would say it's something else. But these are important words. They have significance. They may or may not be exact. But it is important. How long was Israel in the wilderness?
40.
Okay, so we got 40 years. How long did the flood last? We talked about the flood. I purposely didn't say how long. How long did the flood last? 40 days. How long was Isaiah had that 40-day experience? I mean, we get this rich adventures in the Hebrew Bible with this number 40. So Israel is in the wilderness for 40 years. Did they all pass their test? No. So the Jewish mindset is now thinking, will Jesus pass his test? Look at the way it's worded there again. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. So be careful not to read Matthew and Luke here. There are no 4 temptation sequences after this 40-day fast. For Mark, the whole 40 days is a testing. He's tempted for 40 days. It's not this fast and then the tempter comes in these last events. So, how long does Jesus' ordeal last in Mark? 40 days. There's no fasting here. There's no devil. It just simply says he was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan. So, the scriptures uses the word Satan and the word devil. They're not really interchangeable. Diablos is the Greek word. Some of you recognize that. Diablos is the Greek word for devil. It actually means evil. Is what Diablos means. It means evil. But Satan is not an entity, but an office. Any adversary is a Satan. Do you know where Satan first shows up in the Bible? A lot of people thought it was in the creation story. There is no Satan in the creation story. There's a snake. Job. Satan first shows up in the story of Job. Now, what is Satan in Job? He's part of what? He's part of the counsel of God. When God called together the council, he says to Job, Job, what have you been up to? Now, Satan means adversary, prosecuting attorney, an adversary. What is the role of this adversary? In Job, it was to check to see if people were doing what they were supposed to do, right? And so we get the story of Job, and the adversary says to God, says, well, I've been out, doing what I'm supposed to do. And God says, you consider my servant Job. Read this story carefully. You might not like this God after you read it careful. Job was going along fine. Everything was good until God said, you noticed how things are going good for Job? And Satan says, yeah, you won't let me do anything to test Job. Why, if you let me apply the test to Job, Job would curse you. Job doesn't love you. Job's in love with what you do for Job. God said, go ahead. Just don't take his life. And life falls apart for Job. Because the adversary is testing, is Job a true man of faith? Now, this concept develops after that until it becomes an evil in the theology, especially in the church in Christianity. So Satan, not necessarily an entity, but definitely an office. At this time, any adversary is seen as being a Satan or fulfilling that role. And we've got 5 minutes. Of course we do. So it's a test of strength, a test or ordeal. The Greek word is tested by Satan, not tempted. That's different. Okay. Matthew uses the Greek word for tempted Mark uses the Greek word for tested. Some of your translations will say tested. Mine says tempted, unfortunately. But this is a test, an ordeal, not a temptation. Luke and Matthew both say it's a temptation. But in Mark, Mark's Jesus is tried, and the trial lasts for 40 days. It's not a fasting of 40 days and then a temptation. It is a 40-day trial. There's no example here for us to follow when we're tempted to do evil. We don't get that in Mark's gospel. We get that in Matthew. We don't get that here. So Mark does not tell us what ordeals Jesus goes through. We're just told that he's in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Now, when we go back to our story framework that we developed, the way stories in these cultures are told, the key to going forward at this point, when your hero is guided and faces the first adversarial condition, if the hero continues the journey here, there's hope. I think that's true of our journeys too. When we go through the trials of life, just the hardships, just the whatever, if we stay true, there's hope. And we can it's like Elijah under the boom tree. You remember when Elijah, it was right after the greatest, here's another one of these, right after the greatest story in Elijah's ministry, if you will, as a prophet, he had defeated the god of Baal. Dramatic story. And immediately he goes into this deep depression and thinks that he's the only one left, and he's running away, and it's a 40-day ordeal. And God finds Elijah under the boom tree, and God says, Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah says, I'm the only one left who has not turned to worship Baal. Why should I bother anymore? And God says, man, I got stuff going on you don't have a clue about. Get up, get back to work. In Dante's Inferno, the sign hangs over hell. It says, abandon hope, all who enter here. You can't enter here in Dante's story. You can't enter here if you still have hope. See? That's the Inferno. You can't enter here with any hope left. That's where our journey is. That's where our hero is in the journey. All hopeless people in Dante's story are those who have turned their back on the threshold experience. Jesus is at the threshold experience right now. I wonder where he'll go. Stay tuned. Or go ahead and cheat and read ahead if you want to. But we're going to stop it right here for this week. But keep in mind, at the height of your success of your faith, if you will, it's not unusual for that to be followed with a real tough experience. Whether it's baptism and then finding some persecution, if you will, on the other side. It's not unusual. And maybe instead of seeing it as discouraging, maybe we should start looking at it as our faith is genuine. This is the real thing. It's what happened to Jesus. Jesus is my model and guide. I should have expected this. I hope that helps. I hope that encourages you. We'll pick up with that next week and build on that. So go forth into your world this week with hope. Because when things look not so hopeful, God is there. We'll see you.